The Calgary Stampede, written by Catherine Follett. Focus question: what is the Calgary Stampede and what makes it unique? Welcome to Calgary. Calgary, Alberta, where the vast Canadian prairies meet the Rocky Mountains, grew from a cowboy town to a city. Today, it is home to more than 1 million people. Every summer, for more than 100 years, Calgary has put on a huge rodeo and show to celebrate its Western history. Lasting 10 days, the Calgary Stampede, also called the greatest outdoor show on Earth, fills the city with parades, horse shows, carnival rides, barbecues, and more. The rodeo has always been the main attraction, although many people condemn the events for harming animals. Another controversial element of the Stampede is its history. In the 19th century, settlers took over land that Indigenous people had lived on for thousands of years. The Stampede's celebration of Western cowboy culture is tied to this troubling history. Indigenous participation wasn't always permitted. However, over the years, many Indigenous nations began to share parts of their culture at the Stampede. The Calgary Stampede began in 1886 with a local fair called the Calgary Exhibition, where farmers and ranchers showed off their crops, animals, and crafts. Other exhibitions were held over the next several years. Calgary's popular fairs caught the attention of an American cowboy and entertainer named Guy Wiedek. In 1912, Wiedek put on the first Calgary Stampede. It included many of the show's current events: a parade, rodeo, riding demonstrations, and ranching and animal displays. The first Stampede was a huge hit. Wiedek organized stampedes in 1919 and 1923, and the Stampede then joined with the Calgary Exhibition. The new, larger show became a yearly event. The Parade. The Stampede begins on a Friday morning in summer with the streets of downtown Calgary lined with people, most wearing cowboy hats. A sense of excitement runs through the packed crowd. Finally, the sounds of blasting horns and beating drums fill the air. The Stampede Show Band begins to march down the street as people shout their best cowboy "Yee-haw!" At the parade on opening day, cowboys and cowgirls wear their brightest shirts and brush their horses to shine in the morning sun. Enormous draft horses pull painted show wagons. It takes a full 2 hours for the entire parade to pass by. The crowd follows the music toward Stampede Park to watch the events. Farm life and animals. Ranchers and farmers come to the Stampede to show their best animals and compete in traditional blacksmithing and sheep-shearing contests. Huge show barns house hundreds of animals, including horses, beef cattle, dairy cows, woolly sheep, chickens, piglets, and skilled herding dogs. The miniature horses are a crowd favorite. These charming little animals are barely waist-high to an average adult, but they have all the spirit of full-size horses. Children compete in wild pony races. At the other end of the size scale is Draft Horse Town. These horses are enormous, some weighing over 907 kilograms, 2,000 pounds. Draft horses were the tractors of old Alberta. They hauled heavy loads on farms and in factories. The heavy horse pull event shows off their strength and beauty. Teams of straining draft horses drag enormous sleds loaded with massive blocks. Champion teams may pull over 4,537 kilograms, 10,000 pounds. The Elbow River Camp. Nations including the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda all take part in the Calgary Stampede. At the time of the first event, however, the Indian Act of 1876 was in effect, a law that restricted the freedoms of Indigenous peoples. Today, the Indian Act is still law, although certain provisions were later repealed. The Indian Act of 1876. The Indian Act forbade Indigenous people from leaving their reserves, small areas of land the government forced them to live on after taking their ancestral homelands. Children were taken from their families and made to live at schools far away from their homes. If Indigenous people didn't follow the act, they faced fines, forced labor, and even jail time. It was illegal for Indigenous people to wear traditional clothing, speak and sing in their languages, and dance and celebrate their cultures and religions. Although temporary exceptions were granted to participate in the Calgary Stampede, it would be decades before Indigenous people obtained more freedoms. Today, many Indigenous peoples believe the Indian Act hinders the practice of their ways of life. In 1912, Weedick approached representatives of Indigenous nations with a proposal. His vision of the Stampede was dependent upon Indigenous peoples' participation. Working with politicians, Weedick arranged for a suspension of the Indian Act to allow Indigenous people to travel off the reserves and to publicly engage in some cultural practices. Indigenous communities were conflicted. Ultimately, they agreed in order to practice their traditions freely, even if it was only for a short time. 2 years later, however, the federal government passed even tighter restrictions, forbidding Indigenous people to perform and wear traditional clothing in public. Indigenous people could not participate in the Stampede for years after that. Today, Indigenous people are integral members of the Stampede's organizing boards and help plan the event. The name of the gathering place for Indigenous people at the Stampede changed to Elbow River Camp in 2018. The word for Calgary in many Indigenous languages references the bend in the Elbow River. The Stampede continues to be an opportunity for Indigenous communities to share elements of their culture with visitors each year. Many families erect teepees and stay on the festival grounds, inviting visitors inside and teaching them about their traditions, history, and culture. Opening ceremonies include dancing and drumming. Traditional flag raisings and lowerings take place each morning and evening, during which flags for each Indigenous nation, as well as the province of Alberta and Canada, are flown. Daily powwows are also an important part of the Stampede. The tribes each have different traditions that usually include wearing traditional regalia and sometimes dancing competitions. Outdoor cooking demonstrations educate visitors about traditional foods important to each tribe. Meat cutting competitions show the precision necessary to cut thin slices without holes. Beadwork demonstrations, storytelling, and games are also entertaining and educational parts of the Stampede. The Midway and the Grandstand Show. The Stampede isn't only about remembering tradition and history. Just follow the sounds of thrilled screams and laughter to find the bright lights of the Midway. The Stampede's Entertainment Midway is one of the largest in North America. It's filled with people day and night enjoying exciting carnival rides and attractions. Stampede concerts feature the biggest names in rock and country music. You'll also find a juggler, mime, or magician on almost every street corner. The grandstand show is the biggest show. It's like a rock concert, Broadway play, and circus all in one. Students as young as 11 train all year at a performing arts school for the event. The grandstand stage is enormous, full of lights, smoke, and giant screens. It even has floating platforms suspended high over the crowd. Every spot on the stage is filled with performers in elaborate costumes, singing, dancing, and performing amazing acrobatic tricks. Rodeo and chuck wagon races. The biggest and most famous event of the Calgary Stampede is the Championship Rodeo. The grandstand is packed with eager rodeo fans. Western wear is required for anyone stepping into the center ring. Most rodeo events match a rider against an animal that might weigh 10 times as much as they do. In bareback bronc riding, the rider tries to stay atop a bucking horse for 8 seconds without a saddle. They hang onto a strap buckled around the horse's middle with just one hand. The horse leaps, jumps, and twists, trying to shake off the rider. The rider must stay on for the full 8 seconds to qualify. The final winner takes home $100,000. The saddle bronc event is similar, but the cowboy sits atop a saddle, trying to control the bucking horse using reins and stirrups. Next up is bull riding, which also follows the same basic rules. Of course, the cowboy isn't on a horse. They are atop a huge bucking bull. The huge and powerful bulls leap and twist like giant rubber bands. The bull rider needs to hang on for the full 8 seconds and then jump from the bull's back. Sometimes the bull wants to chase the rider down. Before the rider can get hurt, rodeo clowns, skilled bull handlers who rush into the ring to distract the animal, run in. They herd the bull away, and the lucky rider makes their escape. Steer wrestling is just what it sounds like. A rider on horseback chases after a running steer. They jump on the animal and pull it to the ground by its horns. Another exciting event is barrel racing, a timed horse control event. Highly trained horses loop around several barrels in tight turns. This event tests a rider's balance, speed, and skill. The last event is the wild chuck wagon race. Crowds already had a preview earlier in the Stampede with the miniature chuck wagon races. Teams of 4 horses, each pulling a canvas-covered chuck wagon, line up. Then, teams of cowboys called outriders line up their horses behind the wagons. The outriders stand behind a wagon's tailgate. They fling poles and a rubber stove into the back of each wagon. The wagon teams blast away at a gallop, and the outriders leap onto their horses and race after the wagons. The bouncing, rattling, clanging wagons do a dangerous figure 8 around barrels. Then they race around the track at full speed. Pounding horse hooves and rattling wagons shake the grandstand seats. The first-place team wins $100,000 in what's often called the roughest event in rodeo. Until next year. It's been an exhausting but eye-opening 10 days at the Calgary Stampede. Each year, the Stampede involves thousands of workers, volunteers, and participants. It's a lot of hard work to put on a show of this size. The Calgary Stampede is the pride of Calgary. In more recent years, the inclusion of Indigenous perspectives has brought even greater cultural value to the event. It's a unique and memorable way for a city to celebrate and reflect on its history, bring its people together, and show the world what the Canadian West is all about. Connections. Writing. Choose an event from the Stampede to research and learn more about. Create a presentation about the event and share it with your class. Social Studies. Research to learn more about the Indian Act of 1876 and how it affected the lives and culture of Indigenous peoples. Work in small groups to discuss the lasting impact of these laws.
Good job!